On the medieval. To a non-specialist, the Middle Ages appeal, if not to personal taste and idiosyncrasy, then at least to some transpersonal imaginary, which cannot but be based on stereotype, caricature, prejudice, and misconception, if not outright misinformation. I console myself with the conviction that all historical universals are constructed out of just such things, and that if we do not want to be submerged in what Theodor Adorno would have called the nominalism and the positivism of the current business society, we have to try to come to terms with interpretive conceptualities a little larger and more abstract than the immediate archival facts at hand. I note in passing that the very notion of nominalism, produced by the medieval philosophical tradition, is a sign of the untapped vitality of the latter, which I won't touch on further here. So I propose to identify the object of the inquiries in this collection as the imaginary of modes of production, and, in this case, the imaginary of the medieval or peasant feudal mode. And I must first disqualify myself by affirming that I am, to use Max Weber's wonderful expression, religiously unmusical, and am also often tempted to admire the Marquis de Sade's remark, "The idea of God is the sole wrong for which I cannot forgive mankind." I will say something more about theology in a moment, but if I am unable to believe in the idea of belief, I certainly don't want to disparage the priesthood, an institution for which I have some admiration, and some of whose individual members, the priests of liberation theology, for example, are genuine political heroes. All of which leads me to say something positive about the theocratic state, which I take to be a central component of the imaginary of the medieval. Its other dimension, feudal brutality, is for me redeemable only by way of the life of the peasantry, with one signal exception, which I will mention at the end of these remarks. This is not merely an antiquarian matter, since one of the most frequent arguments against socialism affirms the separation of church and state as the foundation of political and social modernity, and identifies the collective project of socialism as one in which ideology and political structure have once again become conflated. There is some truth to this, which is, in my opinion, not adequately addressed by further arguments about whether or not Marxism is a kind of religion. Rather, the utopian core of both the theocratic state and the party state of communist memory lies in the role they assign to intellectuals, a privilege to which any intellectual, no matter how ferociously anti-elitist and ashamed of his or her condition, must be obscurely sensitive. This unconscious attraction, better measured by just such once actually existing societies than by discussion of Plato and wholly imaginary philosopher kings, is not merely an expression of ideological self-interest and of class investment, although it is certainly also that, and the utopian impulse necessarily operates through that class ideological form. It is above all the dream of a society organized around something radically distinct from business, money, acquisitiveness, and what is popularly known as material interest, an expression which has the disadvantage of identifying the critical and oppositional motive in question here as something somehow spiritual in nature. No doubt the clergy always thus identified it, but the party, equally certainly, did not. The point is to isolate what is, for us, attractive and utopian about societies organized in other than materialist ways, and conferring authority on people whose social function and psychology is disjoined from the world of business and the market, as in modern times the determination of artists will be. After that, both social formations, the theocratic and the communist, can be abandoned to the critique of bureaucracy without further nostalgia. And it should also be added as a clarification of the utopian position implicit here that it by no means excludes an identification of the utopian impulse inherent in business itself and in the excitement of entrepreneurial innovation and of the great caravans, indeed, even of the amassing of the great fortunes. The utopian imagination, like the unconscious, does not recognize contradiction and indeed contains within itself many mansions. What of theology, then? To move on to another aspect of medieval imaginary. I believe that its specific superiority over philosophy as a discipline, it being understood that in terms of reason, conceptuality, thinking, theory, and practice alike, it is utterly disqualified by the latter, and in all other respects relegated to the ash can of history, lies in its figural nature. Like myth, it is a form of what Claude Lévi-Strauss called pensée sauvage, which is to say non-conceptual thought and sensory or perceptual abstraction. But unlike myth, it is an extraordinarily elaborated and articulated thinking, developed after the emergence of philosophy, and in full awareness of the latter's conceptual and linguistic resources. It is the repository of a unique figural thinking whose dynamics were not recovered until modern times, with psychoanalysis and modern ideological analysis. But one must not confuse this rich legacy, which runs parallel to philosophy, say for only a few mutual contaminations, with religion as such. I want to identify its fundamental mechanism as allegory, to which I now briefly turn. Medievalists do not have to be given lessons in the multiple forms of allegory, and so I will restrict myself to an attempt to clarify, as much for myself as for anyone else, what it is I have always meant by this term, which somehow seems to originate in that other phenomenon I tend to call auto-referentiality, or in other words, the self-designation of the text. But this is in a rather different fashion from its function in modernism and so-called modernistic works, where it replaces an absent public and furnishes the mode d'emploi, the instructions on the back of the box, for hermetic configurations. In Dante, it is the great representational dilemma, also central to that figural language experiment I described medieval theology as, that governs all the lines, and which means that the poet's language must somehow act out what can, in any case, never be representationally expressed or rendered. People have rightly celebrated Dante's realism, but I have in mind a peculiar poetic structure in which syntax and image are themselves enlisted in a non-representational and yet mimetic operation. I can't convey this any more effectively without examples and textual analysis. Suffice it to say, then, that allegory, on my reading of it, is always intimately related to a crisis in representation, and that the medieval period is an extraordinary laboratory in which to witness its elaborations. Now I come finally to romance, of which for me the Arthurian mysteries are the fundamental expression in all of world literature. To be sure, all the genres of modes of production different from our own, myth, tragedy, epic, Chinese lyric, all offer that unique Luft aus anderen Planeten, that air from other planets, that signals a momentary release from the force of gravity of this one, and our own genres, modernism in one way, science fiction in another, also seek desperately to escape our force field and the force of gravity of our own historical moment. But romance, all the way from Chrétien de Troyes to its most modern echoes in Richard Wagner's Parsifal or the Lancelot of Robert Bresson, has a charm for us that little else matches in its magical transfiguration of human relations. Desire, combat, ritual, betrayal, adultery, obedience, collectivity, disaster, destiny, vocation, are all uniquely recombined in the mode of fantasy and under the narrative category of adventure. And it should be added that the rich tradition of Lacanian analysis of this material also testifies to its generic specificity. But at this point, I feel that my celebration of the medieval really begins to veer far too closely backwards to the area of sheer personal taste, and so I will end here.